Welcome back. I thought I'd do another Dev with Me video in which I go over my Kiro workflows. Just an update as to the last Kiro workflow that I was working on. I was working on a pipeline manager, so an application that manages pipelines based upon a collection of repositories within an account. So if you have like 5 repositories within an account, each of those have certain branches. Some of those branches might trigger a pipeline. They each have their own pipeline. One thing I did not do, even though I explained what the application does and I walked through how I used Kiro to add a feature to that. So if you haven't watched that video, you can certainly go back and watch it. But if you have watched that video and you kind of were looking for a visual representation as to what the application does, I have it here on screen right here. I took a screenshot earlier today of the step function that is executed by the Lambda function after the Lambda function does a whole bunch of inventory. So this is an example of a step function. I'm not going to zoom in on it because it's not so much what it does, but just an overall view as to what a step function is. And given the application that I described and that I was working with in the last video, what all that step function does. So as you can see, there's various branches, decision points, branches. It starts, makes a decision, executes various branches. Sometimes it, might do nothing and go all the way to the end. Other times it might, have a decision as to whether it needs to perform an update or a brand new create or even a delete. And then it goes through and it executes various steps within that step function. And this particular one is executing a bunch of CDKs, so the Cloud Development Kit modules within AWS step functions to basically create all the pieces that you would need for a pipeline. For example, you got AWS code pipeline itself. You've got a AWS code build module as well. And then we have things like notifying the developer who's owner of the repository that the pipeline has been executed. So there's of course a SNS topic as well as a topic subscription that is created. And basically this whole flow goes over what methods need to be taken care of, what steps need to be taken care of to create a pipeline, destroy a pipeline, and update a pipeline. So this is just a visual representation of what I was working on last time. And as I mentioned last time, basically I was able to walk through Kiro and create a new feature, and after deploying it worked perfectly. I was able to get the desired outcome. And again, that really came with, I've done a lot of experimentation with Kiro. I've been working with Kiro quite a bit since I got back from reInvent. It's February 9th now. reInvent was like 2 months ago. So I've had about 60 days, as well as, I swear I've used like 3,900 credits within Kiro. When I first started using Kiro, it was very much just like any other chat interface. I was giving it a prompt, a long prompt about what I wanted to do. Then it would initiate spec-driven development and working with that. With that, I quickly evolved to use steering documents so that way Kiro knew what my expectations and guidelines were, as well as some standards that I wanted to put in place. Those evolved over time in terms of documentation, tests, what I wanted for how I wanted it to update the changelog based upon the requirements that we were putting forth, and the way that I even prompt Kiro initially has evolved. I have a certain structure which I will go over again, but I went over this a lot in the last video. This is just a different project, different project, same sort of workflow, basically, but it's just a different project. So you can see, me apply the same workflow into a different project. But then, how I do my requirements documents, how I present Kiro my requirements. I don't really use the prompt anymore. I basically create a README, and at the end of the README, I say, if you have any questions or for clarification, create a spec questions document with all your questions, and I will respond to them. And that just basically gives me the ability to go in and further go in and give a better response than what I would if it were just a prompt. So once I have that README for the requirements created, I just go to the prompt and I say, hey, I created a new README. Here it is. Review it. If you have any questions, I again, say, make your questions into a document so I can respond to them, and then we'll begin the spec-driven approach. So to just start off, what I have here is I have various specs. Of course, I have my steering documents. So I have multiple steering documents, and these, of course, will help Kiro go in the right direction. As I've said, I put in a lot of credits with Kiro, a lot of time with Kiro. I kind of know where it veers off course, and not necessarily that it veers off course, but I kind of know what my development style is and what it is that we need to be able to accomplish in terms of tests and documentation and stuff like that. So I have kind of fine-tuned my steering documents. They're not the same for every project. They're different between depending upon which project. So I do have a project that is purely like a collection of like 15 CloudFormation templates. So of course that's way different than a Node, than a Lambda function that runs with Node, which is also different than a Lambda function that runs with Python. So depending upon my project, I'll have different steering documents. A lot of them will be the same from project to project, but some of them, will be tailored to that project. I try to keep them a little general. That way I can reuse them from project to project, in hopes that as I and my team learn more about Kiro and develop more with Kiro, we can actually bring some of these together and create a steering document repository. That way when we start a new project, we can actually pull from that repository and populate the Kiro steering directory with applicable things. I would also imagine that you could, because I have done this where, as part of the spec-driven approach, the spec-driven approach hasn't always been code-based. Sometimes I've just had to do documentation. Sometimes I've had to generate steering documents. I've given it a list of steering documents applicable to, or that I've used with other things, and I've said, refine these specific to this project, given it some parameters. Sometimes I can give it like just like 5 to 6 lines in a paragraph and say, this is what I need in a steering document. Go ahead and flesh it out, and it will come back with like a fully fleshed out steering document in terms of like how a changelog should be formatted and requirements, and give itself, requirements to follow and stuff like that. So it kind of makes things up on the fly as well, but it's all based upon industry best practices and other things that Kiro kind of has been trained on. So instead of me spending a week or two generating all these documents and even requirements documents, I can just hand it over to Kiro and say, hey, this is what I have in mind. Go and create a steering document or whatever. So as mentioned in the previous video, I structure my specs very much by the package version number. That way I have them all in a chronological order. That makes it easier. If I didn't have the version number here, it would just be alphabetical list of all these different requirements, and that's not helpful for like understanding what came before what. And I would imagine after a while, because as long as I'm keeping my documentation up to date and my tests up to date, maybe after a shelf life of like a year or two or whatever I decide, I might even like start archiving some of these and removing those from the repository because they're probably not needed anymore. Like if I get to version 3.5.6, I probably don't need these anymore. But for right now, I'm just kind of hanging on to them just in case there are any fixes, because sometimes you'll implement a change, a feature or a fix or whatever, and then you deploy that package, that version of your release, and then you find out that there's a bug. Well, Kiro can go back and look at the previous requirements and say, oh yeah, that wasn't fully implemented, or there was a issue. Your requirements say this, but now it seems that you need this. So it then can refer back to, okay, to adhere to the previous requirements, I did this, so now I need to change it to this. So then there's that versioning, that it can go back and it can refer to what it previously did. And again, after a year or two, you probably don't need that, so you can just archive it. But even archiving it would be helpful to know what the version number is. So I do have a few future versions scoped out here, kind of like in a roadmap as I gather information. So right now, where this project is a cache data project, and that is actually a project that's available on one of my GitHub accounts, 63K Labs. I do a lot of my development work underneath 63K Labs. I wouldn't say, I mean, I've developed it all personally, but these are a collection of repositories and resources for particularly SAM development, serverless application model development on AWS, in which I have templates, resources, tutorials, starter code, learning materials, stuff like that. So if you're interested in SAM, serverless application module development within AWS, I definitely recommend checking out this site, because again, it just has tutorials and sample code and a whole bunch of stuff to get you going. There's a lot of tutorials out there, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this is a whole other video, but there's a lot of tutorials out there that are great and they get you started with a lot of the concepts, but a lot of what is discussed in there, just because they need to be surface level, they don't go deep into what it really takes to have a production ready product. And granted, the resources that I have here, could they be used for a Fortune 500 company? Probably, but that's not who this is for. This is for those who have completed the tutorial, have a good understanding of serverless, or even if you want to start, there's resources here to get you started. But this is like the next step after tutorials, to like do deeper dives into how you actually use a CI/CD pipeline to test and deploy your application, with proper monitoring, logging, metrics, version control, all that stuff. So I have all that here. What we're going to be focusing on today is this package here called cache data. It's actually a npm package. So the README, all the code is here, but if you wanted to check out the npm package, it is on npm, and you can actually include it in your projects as well. And again, there's documentation as to how to do that on this site. So what this is it is a, with So if you've written anything in Express.js, you know that there is the ability to cache. So Express.js is basically a JavaScript framework, Node JavaScript framework, that allows you to create a web service like an API that can receive requests and then respond to those requests with API data. It's basically a server architecture in that it's a server running, waiting for a request to come in. When a request comes in, it issues a response based upon, whatever it was requesting. It has caching available within it. One thing about Lambda, and I get into this with, some of my tutorials and stuff like that, Lambda isn't a server, it's serverless. But you do have instances. So if a request for a bunch of blog posts comes in, so like it wants a listing of your blog posts, your API can receive that, go connect to a backend data source, whether that's a database, DynamoDB, or other API endpoint, and do a query, get that data back, and then send it back to the client. Well, another request comes in, maybe it's requesting the same information. Rather than going all the way back and even to a remote endpoint, which could add latency, it will cache that information within memory. So Express.js already has that built in. You can do that with Lambda as well. The caveat with Lambda is that if you have a really busy application that's handling multiple requests, Lambda, because it's serverless, and another aspect of that is it's not, a Lambda function is not handling multiple requests at once. If it's in the middle of handling a request and another request comes in, another Lambda function is created. So another instance is created. So it scales that way. It scales by creating additional Lambda functions. And then it scales down as needed. Well, if your Lambda function 1 has that data cached in memory, when a Lambda function is created to handle another request, that in-memory cache is not available. So then it needs to go back to the endpoint and get that and get the data fresh. So caching is only as good as the Lambda function that handles it. Cache data, this package basically creates a caching layer that uses DynamoDB. It leverages DynamoDB in Amazon S3 to cache data and share it amongst all your Lambda functions. And it doesn't even need to be of the same application. You can actually, there are ways. It's not this way by default, just so that security is there. But it is able to when it receives a request for data, it can go to an endpoint, whether that's DynamoDB or wherever, get the data fresh from the source, store that in a DynamoDB that's reserved for caching. That way it has quick access for the next request, and then send it back. When the same request comes in, maybe from another client or whatever, it goes through, checks the DynamoDB. Oh, that data is already there, so it retrieves that and then sends it back. It reduces the latency because accessing DynamoDB in that instance typically has been like 140 milliseconds. Very short time. I've even seen like shorter times as well. Well, that's all well and good. And that DynamoDB, because you have multiple requests coming at once because you got a busy application, your one Lambda function handles it, stores it in the cache. Your other Lambda function is spun up. It can access that same cache. It doesn't need to refresh its own cache. Now, I did implement in-memory caching so that if that Lambda function has already seen that data, it can just serve from the cache and then you get sub-millisecond latency for that request. But if it hasn't seen that yet, it can then fall back on the shared DynamoDB database, get that information from there, and then return it back to whatever function is requesting it. And if there's a miss there, then it goes to the original source. So cache data has it already implemented that there's in-memory cache. There is a DynamoDB, kind of like a backup, shared amongst all the Lambda functions, and then it can fall back. So all the user needs to do, all the developer needs to do, is basically have use one of the functions for the cache data and say, this is the data I need, give it the query, essentially, and if it's not in the cache, access the endpoint or the data using this function. So it gives it a function for the remote call. And then cache data receives that request, on the cache data layer, and says, yes, I've seen this data before, here it is, or I haven't seen that data before, I'm going to use the function that you passed on to me and go and get that data fresh, store it in the cache, that way it's available for next time, and then return the data back. So that's just like an overall view. A lot more of that is listed in the GitHub repository. There's diagrams and stuff like that. I just went through with Kiro recently to update the documentation, as well as the inline code documentation as well. So hopefully it's a lot better. I've noticed that after I've updated the documentation, Kiro has been a lot more helpful, so because it actually has good documentation. So that was one of the things that I did with this project, was I updated the documentation first before I did a development project with Kiro. You didn't see me do it, but I referenced doing the similar thing in the previous project that I had a video about. Okay, so that's just an overview of the project. So what we're going to do, and whether you're interested in the project or not, for what I'm going to do here is start going over my workflow as to how I'm going to add a feature to that project. So as I mentioned, the current release is 1.3.7. I'm going to be working on the next release, which is 1.3.8. So I have I've already gone through and I've spent some time creating the requirements documents for the 3 features or the 3 updates for that version. And as I mentioned, I've kind of already planned out a roadmap for subsequent versions as well. I'm not going to go through those today. I kind of consider those a different sprint. I try to do a sprint with something that I can accomplish within a weekend, and then release it, see how that works, fix any bugs that come up, and once it's stable, move on to the next one, to the next version. So I have the other one scoped out. So what I'm going to do first is I'm in the middle of trying to move some of my stuff from Mocha to the Jest framework. So I'm going to do this one here, which is the test migration phase 2. So I opened up that README. As you can see, this README is basically any test written in Mocha, and I have various classes here. So I have a whole bunch of classes. Not only does this npm package handle caching, it is somewhat of a replacement for Express.js as well. So it handles routing, client requests, and a whole bunch of other things that you might find useful if you're creating a web service. So any test written in Mocha for APIRequest, DAO endpoint, and AWS classes should be migrated to the Jest framework. Any test area that are lacking in these modules should be generated so that it is fully tested. Care should be taken not to introduce breaking changes. So I already have some tests written in Mocha. I want to make sure that it compares the two. So after migration, the Mocha test should be retained and continue to be used in the test suite until all tests have been migrated. I should say all tests in this and future versions have been migrated. This will ensure that there's no discrepancy between the two tests during the entirety of the migration. Ask clarifying questions in the spec questions MD in this directory, and the user will respond with answers there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I have a new README. Let me make sure I save this. And which one is this? All right, so I'm going to have it review the README. I told it to ask clarifying questions here, and we'll see what it comes up with. So as you can see, as it started out, it said it would review the README, and then went ahead and included the steering documents. As I said, this was great for like not having a long prompt. Also, using a README like this is great for not having a long prompt too. One of the READMEs that I'll be going over just to like give you an idea is I have one for security fixes in which I just added a bunch of information to, and a lot of this was just copied and pasted from what GitHub Copilot gave me based upon a security audit, since everything's already in GitHub. Dependabot and the security AI there already like goes through analysis and code stuff and gives recommendations, so I just brought that over. Another README that I created, here's another example in which I actually like give example code as well as longer README in terms of stuff. So they can be basic, they can be a little more, but it is a way for me to get all my thoughts and some research in there if I need it. If I don't have a steering document yet created, I can, one of the tasks can be first create a steering document that does X. All right, so I did the migration. It did not have any questions. If it does, it will create, as I told it to create another document. It didn't. If you wanted to see what one of those documents are and how thorough it is in terms of like, if you just have it ask you questions within the prompt, just ask like one-liner things, and then you kind of can give back one-liner answers. But I've noticed that if I have it ask me those questions in a document, it will be more thorough. It will give me more of its thought process, its questions with examples that I can then give a more thoughtful response to. So I've kind of moved away from using the prompt and really like saying, hey, refer to this document and let's talk within a document context. When you do that, the context window, if you're familiar with AI and chat windows, context windows, they're limited, and if you put too much information in it, it could kind of get lost. But Kiro very much looks at documents. So if it can consume all the documents, it really provides a lot more context, and then the context window doesn't, overflow and stuff like that. So it reviews all the steering documents. Great. So now it's going to use those to help guide it, steer it. And a lot of that stuff has to do with like creating a test harness for private classes, what the test requirements are, naming conventions that I use, documentation standards, changelog convention, as well as AI context reference for this project. So I'll help you create a comprehensive spec for the test migration phase. Let me start by examining the existing directory structure and all that sort of stuff. So it reads through all that, searches, looked at each of the classes that I talked about, and now it's going to examine the source files to understand what it needs to be tested. Goes through that, and now it creates a comprehensive spec for the test migration phase 2. Let me start by reading AI context to understand the repository's requirements and constraints. Now then it checks to see if there's any existing Jest tests. And it says now I have the context. And then it created the requirements. Alright, so now I will read through these requirements. If there's anything, and again, this is using the steering documents as well as my little description here. It started the development process to generate the user stories, acceptance criteria, and so it created what, 10 requirements with user stories based upon what I gave it. Oh, it also came up with a glossary. Again, so spec-driven shouldn't be avoided because it's a lot of work. This probably took me 20 minutes to frame. Longer ones can take me half an hour to an hour, just because I'm going and I'm gathering information as any developer should, to make sure that I have naming conventions right and documentation, pulling from documentation, making sure that I have all that right. It goes through and it just generates all this for you, which would be, acceptable to turn in for pretty much any project. So, as always, I'm going to read through this line by line, make sure that if there's any changes, if it got something wrong, or if I didn't specify anything well enough, and so therefore it kind of made an assumption, that I fix that. And I can just like update it here, then hit refine, and then it will, make changes. So give me a chance to read through this and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've had a chance to review it. The only change I made, and this is probably on the screen earlier, for some reason it misspelled Mocha. It was M-O-O-C-H. It was Mooch. So that was the only fix that I needed to do. I'm going to go ahead and hit design phase. So now it's going to take that and it's going to create a design document. Another thing that I had, so a couple weeks ago I had Kiro update the tests as well as documentation, and one of the things that I had was documentation requirements, because this is a package that is used, of course, by developers, so they have to know how to use a package. It's also in production, so any commits to the repository, I need to ensure that not only do the tests run during the CI/CD deployment process when it packages the package and sends it over to NPM, there's tests that run, and those tests need to pass. If they don't pass, it doesn't get published, because of course all tests should pass before the release is actually released. Well, one thing that Kiro also did was to create commit hooks. So if I'm developing something and I commit my code to the repository, on my machine, it has a commit hook that will automatically run all the tests, and it won't let me commit code to the repository unless all those tests pass. So I can, of course, override that. I can say, yeah, I know they don't pass. Go ahead and commit them anyway because I just want to save my work. But it is a good checkpoint for me to see that if I expected all the tests to pass and they don't, that I'm just not like oblivious to the fact that I have failing tests and this code is not okay to then move into test and then the main branch. Alright, so it created the design document, so I now have the design document here. Design document basically it's going to outline the approach for migrating the existing Mocha tests into Jest for 3 modules: APIRequest, class, APIRequest, DIO, and AWS classes. Again, it states again that migration will maintain backward compatibility, ensure no breaking changes, and run both test frameworks in parallel during the transition period. The design also addresses test coverage gaps and establishes patterns for future test migration. As I said, all the current tests should be replicated and you should have the same end result between whether it's Jest or Mocha. But also see if there's any gaps in the test. Maybe I'm not testing a whole code base at this particular module or function. Go ahead and develop new tests as well. So basically not just migrate but also enhance. Use this time to enhance the tests. So then it goes through, lets me know what it's going to be doing, validation, safety, confidence, and consistency, what modules are in scope. So again, I specifically said these modules are in scope. That way it doesn't do anything with the other modules. So these are in scope. It identifies what those modules do, goes over the architecture of the test file organization. Again, it said that it was going to maintain the structure that I already have. So it reviewed the structure I'm already using and it will adhere to that. So it goes through that workflow. Yeah, so this is what a design document is. It basically goes over structure, architecture, stuff like that. Sample code, it'll go over some sample code. A lot of times it'll say before changes, after changes. So this here, it's giving a comparison between Mocha and Jest. And the template that it's going to use for when it creates tests, and then mock management, data models, migration status, and correctness properties. So then it gives properties, and it uses this to create a property test to make sure that what it developed is correct. That's one great thing about Kiro and the spec-driven development process is that you have requirements, you have specifications. It creates all those user stories, and then it creates essentially tests to make sure that what it develops adheres to the user stories that we created. So here are the requirements and the properties that it goes through. So I'll give myself a moment to review all this, and then I will have it move on to the implementation plan. Alright, so I've given it some time to review everything. It's got all the requirements, and everything is in order after I went through all of this. I've noticed that I'm going to go ahead and move to implementation. So I've noticed that as I've refined my workflow, as I've refined the steering documents and the way that I gather my own requirements before I have Kiro develop the requirements, there's a lot less miscommunication, just as you would with a human team, really. And again, the human team isn't discarded by any means. many of my projects, we gather, we meet, we figure out what the requirements are. I'm given code snippets, I'm given diagrams. I need to translate that for Kiro to use. If I have any questions while I'm like compiling my list of requirements, I can then go get information and come back and add that to my document. That is part of the reasons why it takes, depending upon the scope of the particular spec that I'm developing for, that it could take a day or two. And a day isn't necessarily 8 hours, of course. I could spend 1 hour one day and 2 hours the next day refining that. But I do it over a multi-day process. That way I have a chance to start the requirements, go to my team with any questions, get responses. It's always great to also, even if it's a individual project, to get requirements down and then back away from it. Go do other things. It's going to, oh, one moment. It's asking me if I want to make all tasks required or not. I'm going to do it required. As I mentioned in the previous video, I just always do make all tasks required because pretty much all my projects are comprehensive from the start. If you need it, if you're just experimenting and you just want to save Kiro credits because it's credit based, then yeah, you could certainly make things optional, but these are production things, so I'm going to make it all required. But getting back to the requirements in the multi-day approach, it gives you time to walk away, just like you should with any project, especially if you're stuck on something. Walk away, give some time, either it's, an hour, a break, lunch, whatever, but that way you can come back to it with a fresh mindset and review your requirements, make sure they still make sense to you, and also like see where there might be any gaps. So then you can go back, you could flesh that out a little bit more, or maybe you find out that a few things are redundant, or maybe you want to reorganize a few of your notes. You can certainly do that. So I definitely recommend, as you're creating your requirements document, again, it doesn't need to be perfect. It's definitely not anything that I would ever hand in as part of a class or a project. But it's notes. Just make sure that you've spent enough time, given it its due diligence to do your research and to give it as much information as needed. All right, so it's completed the tasks document, so I can now go to the task document, and I'm basically, you could do one of two things here. Again, I strongly recommend reading through everything line by line. Maybe you missed a step, maybe you missed something. This is just one of those things where if you can catch not necessarily a mistake, but anything that you can clarify early on, it will help down the road. So what I'm going to do is I am going to start the first task after I read this, of course, and review it. So the first task is set up the Jest configuration and test infrastructure, verify Jest is installed, and dev dependencies, says it's already present. Create or verify. That's just basic stuff. Oh, and you can like hover over the requirements and it will refer back to what the requirements are. So then you can see what the requirements are in the user story. So I'm just going to start that. And as it's doing this first task, it may have you approve certain prompts. If it asks for approval, I'll certainly show that to you. But for right now, what I'm going to do is that while it's completing task 1, which is a very safe task, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start reviewing all the other tasks to make sure that they align with my vision. Okay, so everything looks good. I do want to mention that for these projects, and basically for all of my projects, just because it's helpful for um, anybody who comes after me in working on this project, especially when they're organizational projects, so team projects. It's helpful to keep your basically everything you do within Kiro inside your repository. That way you have it documented. You have the steering documents there. That way anybody can clone the repository and they have the steering documents right there available to them. So for any team environment, definitely keep your specs as well as your steering documents in your repository. For any public repository, that's basically up to you. If it's a repository in which you have external team members contributing, or it's a repository that others fork or clone or copy to their own and then they develop on their own, it's just kind of one of those nice things that you can certainly add to it. But I do keep all my specs as well as steering documents in my repositories. So if you ever wanted to clone one of these repositories or copy it to your own machine and see how I have some of the steering documents or use some of these steering documents, they are here for you to use. So I keep them with the repository. That way other contributors can use Kiro and they have the proper steering documents. That is actually one of the requirements that I have for any of my publicly accessible repositories, is that if it's been enhanced with Kiro, Kiro needs to be used to provide any AI generated code and contribution back to the repository. So I keep the steering documents here so you can always review them for your own projects. You can see what I do with my requirements, and once I get through these this new update, you'll see that these documents are also available there too. Okay, so I'm just going to start the next task. While it's starting, I'm going to review this. It didn't have any questions for me because I was just basically doing some basic stuff at the very beginning. But as you can see, we're now on the next step. There are how many tasks? There are 10 tasks. One thing about getting to this point is that I can have it complete task 2 and then just be done for the night and commit my code to the repository, and then whether I'm on this machine or next machine or even another team member can then clone my changes, or not clone but pull my changes and continue on where I left off. Again, they'll have the same steering documents, they'll have the same requirements and specs, and they'll have the same task list. So this is one of those things where you could have a developer who's in charge of creating the steering documents and the specs, and then reviewing the design requirements, the design, and generating the tasks, and then checking all that into a repository with the project, and then have another developer pull all that stuff down and start executing the task list. So this is also one way that unlike ChatGPT or anything like that, you actually have a workflow, a shareable workflow in all aspects with Kiro. So I see it's creating a few analysis documents as it said it would. So it's analyzing the tests, it's creating some of those outputs here. That's also a nice feature of Kiro, is it will create documentation, analysis, reports. You can tell it to do a report. I did that with the documentation quality fixes. I believe that was this project. Yeah, I had it do a summary before it got started. Yeah, so then it did created all these things. It even created the steering document for me that I told it to, created the pre-commit hook, as well as a fix, and it gave me all that information. So yeah, so it's giving me a summary now of the analysis, which is great. So I could review everything, or I could just go review the analysis here, see where it is on task 2. Yeah, and you can always go back and you can always review what it did on the tasks. I can look at this. It hasn't done anything for the summary yet, so I'll just close that. I can, looks like I completed everything for task 2. It gives me a summary, which I can read through. But another thing you can do is you can view changes. So it basically gives you a diff. Now, this is a brand new document. So in fact, we're just still like in the document creation phase here of these tasks. But if you were at a task and it was doing any code changes, you could click on view changes and like see what it changed. It's always helpful to review code. I wouldn't say that there were a few times where I went in and I found that Kiro made a mistake or Kiro did something I didn't want it to do, because again, it's following my requirements, and as long as my requirements are right, it pretty much does things right. But maybe there were comments I wanted to add. One thing about changing code, though, of course, is when you change code, especially if it's a functional change, sometimes even if it's, depending upon the types of tests Kiro generates, it might be looking at output of a console log. So if you change stuff like that, you could be breaking a test. So if you needed to manually go in and do a code change, you can certainly do that, but then let Kiro know that you did that and run the tests. Otherwise, especially if you made a code change that went against a requirement that you gave Kiro, because then if it goes in and it goes to make another change and it sees that code doesn't adhere to the requirements, it'll bring that up. I don't know what it would do exactly. I don't know if it would like go and say, hey, this test is breaking, the requirements say this, I need to go back and I need to change the code and then just undo what you did, or if it would prompt you, the user, to say, hey, this code was developed in my previous iteration and now it's different than what I created. It's no longer going along with the requirements. Should I change the requirements or should I change the code? I have had it ask me a similar question to that once. But when you're doing things like this, it's just, if you need to make changes and they're kind of functional changes or things that might break a test, I just typically just let Kiro do it. That also brings up the question, if once you kind of hand a project over to Kiro, are you stuck using Kiro for all your code changes? So are you, I wouldn't say no longer in control, because you're still in control, but as a developer, are you no longer a developer? Are you just essentially a project manager, gathering requirements, and then in this task and validation process, a senior software engineer who ensures that what is being produced is correct, and you're not really hand editing or developing anything by hand anymore? That's a valid concern. One way, as I've mentioned, in order to use Kiro effectively, you really need to have a good understanding of software design practices, patterns, know how to efficiently create loops, and all that great stuff. It's not so much about the language, it's really about design patterns and making sure that your code is efficient and using best practices. And as a well-seasoned senior software engineer, you can identify issues that, hey, maybe we don't want to use this database, we should be using a different database. Maybe we shouldn't be doing a whole bunch of nested if statements. We can do a mapping instead. And you can catch those on the design phase and propose those to Kiro, saying, hey, what about this? I mean, for as many times as Kiro has, like, or any AI agent provided me with design ideas that I hadn't thought of that were good, there's been a few where I'm like, that's great, but let's think about it from this way. Or a future requirement will be this, so let's make sure that that can be met without making that within scope, you know? Um, a good software engineer will be able to like identify those things, or and not just software engineers, it's whatever you're creating, cloud infrastructure, stuff like that. A good engineer who knows how the product works, who knows how the platform works, who knows about languages and architecture, should be able to catch those um, early on and help guide AI. And maybe that's about, creating another steering document, or just hopping into the chat and steering Kiro or any agent the right way. But the importance of knowing the fundamentals of computer science essentially is key. If you go down this route of letting AI, using the spec-driven approach, and I'm not talking about vibe coding, that's something totally different, which I just don't do, um, unless it's like a very experimental personal side project that I know is just for learning and experimentation, stuff like that. That's completely different. Um, when you hand something over to a spec-driven approach, you kind of take your hands out of it. Where you can still find yourself useful from a developer aspect, I found, is if you are experimenting or creating something completely new. You don't even, like, we all have those projects where we don't even know where to start. We have what the end user wants as requirements, but we don't even know how to get there. We don't even know what questions to ask. We don't even know what to tell Kiro. Sometimes you probably do want to do a vibe coding session, experiment. That code will not see the light of day in terms of production. But if you're like, yeah, I do need a Lambda function that uses Python to manage AWS resources. How does that even work? Start a vibe coding session with Kiro or your AI of choice and get in there, get your hands messy, understand how it works, develop things by hand. And then when you come back with a better understanding, if you have code snippets or a module that works great, bring that with you when you come to the requirements phase. Bring that code with you. Bring the code snippets. Bring what you learned with you to the requirements phase. Um, it's basically like any project manager, or even what was it? There was that API case. I think even with Oracle and Java, in which the judge went. I mean, not that the judge became an expert developer or anything, but they went and they learned. They taught themselves how to code a little bit. So that way they had a better understanding as to how the API and stuff works. Still experiment, still go down those learning paths. If you're coding in a language that you've never coded in and you're having AI develop something like Go or whatever, it might help you to actually go develop something in Go or Rust or whatever before you actually go to Kiro. So still take that time to learn, still take that time to hand code and bring something to Kiro to work with. It'll help you, it'll help Kiro, it'll also prevent you from just like clicking a button, start next task, every time. So that's what I would recommend. And I would definitely recommend that for any team looking at using this as an approach to development, because especially when you have junior engineers or students, your uh, internships or anything like that, the only way people will learn is through hands-on learning, coding, and actually working with code rather than just having AI develop it. Once they have that firm understanding as to how to code and they continue to refine their coding practices, they'll be able to use AI a lot better. So, as a team, as a developer, don't um, don't let that escape you. It's still valuable to get your hands dirty, to experiment and to learn new things, and not just hand it over to AI, because AI is only going to get you so far. You're going to have to actually know some stuff. All right, so it looks like I have an error implementing a test. An unexpected error occurred. Very helpful. Um, no context as to that, so let's just hit retry. I'm going to close some of my other windows here. If this, okay, so that completed, so I don't know what it was. Sometimes if it has an error, it'll say like chat with Kiro to fix, and then you can like have like a chat session with Kiro to like figure out. A lot of times Kiro will ask you, hey, this test is failing, but it's expected because I wrote this test and the functionality isn't there yet. So, you know, sometimes it'll come back with a question. Do you want me to fix this and move on? Or do you want me to add this to the task list to come back to? And then you can always come back to it later. You like after you fix everything, you can always come back to it and try to fix it later. So it looks like it's moving on. It looks like it's making progress. So whatever happened was just a temporary thing. We'll just name it on a network bug or something like that. But we're on task 4 of 10. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video right now and wait for it to execute. Okay, so we're in the last part of task 4.7, and it's asking me for input. So this is one of those things where it'll run a command and it'll, so that it kind of doesn't go off and just do a whole bunch of destructive stuff, it'll ask you permission. This particular command is just an echo command. That's no big deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do trust, and then it's going to ask me the full command or just the echo. Now, that can be tricky. I mean, this is not a bad command or anything like that. It's just echo. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trust it. I could see where that could give some people concern, especially you see here we're chaining various things together. But I'm not concerned about it doing this. So I'm just going to say base echo. So echo star, which means that anytime it needs to run an echo command, it'll just do it from now on. If I wanted to I think I missed my window of opportunity. Um, after you select a command, or even say you just wanted to like scope down the full command, it'll like come up down in the lower right and it'll say if you want to edit this command in terms of like all the trusted stuff, there's a configuration that allows you to go and store all your trusted commands. And pretty much I do the safe ones like echo, run, test, stuff like that. Um, so I just do that there. But yeah, it saves a whole bunch of it, prompting you to, hey, can I run this? All right, so all 17 Jest passed pass, all 8 Mocha passed. Both suites are successful with the npm run test all. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, and this would be a great spot for a checkpoint. It sometimes gives itself checkpoints in which it will uh, um, verify that everything that's done so far is correct and all the tests are passing and stuff like that. But it's always good to save your work, and when you're working with Git repositories, save it by committing your code. Alright, so I've saved my code, committed everything to the repository, and now I will start the next task. Okay, I am running task 7, and I've noticed that this was a longer list, but as you can see, something is just adding all these temp files here. So I went to Kiro and I asked if it was stuck in a loop, and for some reason my prompts are getting duplicated. And so it says, hey, let me check if there's something running. Nope, there's nothing running, and yet I'm seeing, all that happening. I ask another question. Again, my prompt again gets duplicated. It's checking to see what's going on. It says, I see the problem. Dozens of Mocha tests running simultaneously, and it kills the Mocha tests, supposedly. I'm running them, remove all these temp files, but as you can see, even as we're talking, it's filling up. And now it says, good, let me run the test properly. The issue is that multiple test processes are spawned running in parallel. Let me run the Mocha test once. And basically, it's still doing its thing. So obviously there's something going on here. I may, if Kiro's not able to resolve this, I may just close the IDE and start it up again, because it's obvious. I might even have to restart my computer because there's obviously something going on here. So how I would troubleshoot this is, obviously Kiro's not killing the processes that need to be killed. So I'd probably stop the IDE, start it again, and then if that doesn't start, yeah, so it died, or maybe it did it on its own. If that didn't work, then I'd probably restart the computer. So it looks like nothing new. So we're probably good. All right. So, okay. I mean, I could do this myself, but there. I mean, it just did a simple remove command. All right. So, let's get back to task 7. Let's see what happens. Alright, so we see it starting again. This is one of those things where it's like, well, does Kiro know that this is happening? Is it continuing on? I believe it was in the last project that I made a video about in which I actually had Kiro monitor the test to make sure that they weren't running and going awry. But I don't think it's doing anything here. So I should just like step in and say, it appears that the tests are and we'll see what happens. And again, it's duplicating my things. Alright, so that time it looks like it did the kill. And it seems like it worked. So we're going to check with the test setup. Okay, so it's going to run the test. It's going to tail it, so it looks like it's going to be watching what's happening. I don't know how long it's going to let it run. It's so interesting. So I asked it, how long are you going to let the loop run? It says, you're right, I should stop this task, or I should stop this immediately. The tests are running. With the include property-based tests, that can take a very long time. Let me kill the process. I don't know if that's exactly the case, but it's going to kill the process. It says it could take 5 to 10 minutes to run the thing. I mean, gives me 3 options, 1, 2, or 3. 1 is run full, 2 by category, and 3 is mark it as complete. I don't want to mark it as complete because obviously this is an issue that needs to be taken care of. One of the things, of course, is that these tests will be running in the CI/CD pipeline. So I don't want, when I'm deploying this and packaging it for NPM, of course I don't want the remote server to be, stuck in a loop. Especially with GitHub Actions, I don't even know how I would even stop. I'm sure the GitHub Actions has a limit, but I don't want to hit that limit. Especially if we're running on code build, I don't want to incur those charges. It still doesn't. Oh, it might have stopped. Okay, so I'm going to trust this one, and I'm just going to do npx Mocha as a trust partial. I could open my settings, and these are all the ones that I've approved it to do. So if you could like approve a long one and then come in here, like suppose I wanted to just to do all CloudFormation, or this was like AWS CloudFormation validate template, and it listed the template name. I could always go in and add, remove a whole bunch and then just add the star if I wanted to. So let's see what this is doing. Alright, so it says the task is complete. I'm going to have it clean up. And I'm going to have it clean up the temp validation files. One of the things that I would do, because this was kind of one of those loops where Kiro was saying it had fixed it, but obviously it hadn't, and then it wasn't doing its own cleanup. This is one of those things where if I noticed that it were happening again, I would stop executing tasks. And then I would put on my software engineer hat and basically, have Kiro run a limited number of tasks to see if we could get it to happen again. If we run this category of tasks and it's fine, then we run this category of tasks and it happens, then we know where to look. And I see it's happening right now. So it seems like whenever it runs the cache data tests. So I'm going to have Kiro kind of look at the cache data tests. So okay, so basically I said, I wonder if I can expand this. I said the loop is happening again. We need to fix this before moving on. Please identify the issue and come up with a fix, as we can't have tests run in an endless loop and fill up the disk space. Okay, so I just also added on to that. I basically said, I'd said, please identify the issue and come up with a fix, as we can't have tests run in an endless loop and fill up disk space. Please create a steering document that ensures you monitor tests during local development to prevent loops in long-running tests. So I'm just going to put that in the chat. And again, it's duplicating stuff. I'm just going to do the full command. It says, yes, this is a serious issue. There are hundreds of test processes running in an infinite loop. Let me kill these processes first. Okay. All right, let's see if it actually did it. It looks like it did. All right, so now let me investigate what's causing the loop. Let me check the test files for any recursive test execution. The problem is here. This test file runs npm test commands recursively, which causes an infinite loop because when you run test, it runs all files, including the property test. That could be a problem. And then this property test then runs a test again. So basically, it created a property test to run all the tests. And because it's a property test, it's one of the tests that it'll run. So that gets swept up again. So yes, it's a recursive process. Yes, exponential explosion of the test process. Let me create a steering document to prevent this and fix the issue. That is pretty good. If you're going to run a test that runs other tests, make sure that the test that runs other tests is not included in the test that runs other tests. All right. So it's going to document the fix. So it identified a critical issue and it fixed it. Infinite loop bug, serious infinite loop bug in the test suite. Yep, it goes over the problem, goes over the fix. Create a steering document, so text execution monitoring. So now we should have some monitoring. We'll check out that steering document in a moment. So what it did, next steps. It's now safe to run, it says. However, it did not complete task 7.5. So, okay, so it says even though it's marked as complete, I'm going to let it run, and I'll review the steering document. I could make any additional safety improvements. In fact, I could even come back to that. I might like even ask Kiro, what other additional safety improvements would you recommend? So I'll do that after I go look at the steering document. So let's go back, look at the steering document. Hopefully it cleans up its mess. So it created steering document test execution monitoring. So just upon my little dialogue with it and understanding what happened, it created this huge steering document that will now include every single time it does anything else. Run. Okay, so basically the core principle, bad example, good example. Rule 2, direct test runner invocation. And it gives like some stuff there. Use a different file extension. That's good. So test file naming, exclusions, monitor test processes during development. That's great. Because that was actually something that came up in another project. So it's great that during development, and again, it doesn't need to monitor it while it's in CI/CD, but when it's locally, it should be monitoring that because it's in development. Test execution timeouts. So it's going to give it a timeout. That's good too. Never use default num runs of 100, detecting infinite loops. So we'll do that if you detect one. Test execution patterns. Yep. So then it goes over that stuff. Pre-commit. So it's going to do a pre-commit checklist. And a whole bunch of stuff here. So it does all that. So I'm just going to ask, are there other testing test execution let me just make sure I spelled this correctly. All right. So it's going to review what it created based upon what I told it to create, which already was pretty extensive. But it had asked me, is there anything else to add? And I'm like, well, I don't know. You know, because it has a whole body of knowledge of like best practices and stuff like that. So it probably has more to add, which is one of the great things about these steering documents is that you don't have to have all the knowledge. You can just say, hey, in your infinite wisdom, Kiro, come up with a steering document that, make sure that it implements this and make sure that it puts these guardrails in, and you can have it expand on that. As you can see, it expanded quite a bit. If this is any judge as to where the end of the file was, we almost have about 1,000 lines. So yeah, so then it gives a summary. So Resource limits, so memory limits. That's awesome. Test isolation, parallel execution, CI/CD specific, GitHub actions, retry logic for flaky tasks, artifact cleanup. I probably, this one itself doesn't, but if I want to reuse this, I probably would want to make sure that also adds code build, but I think we'll be fine for right now. Performance documentation. Health check on command, no tests. So basically, because it mentioned GitHub Actions specifically, and this one does use GitHub Actions, it doesn't use a code build actions, but I have other ones that do. I want to make sure that this document is reusable for other projects in which I am using code build. So I just wanted it to update this where it talks about CI/CD specific GitHub Actions. I wanted to include code build as well. So it's going to do that. Good. And again, I can go over this. I'm to the point where I'm able to read this and get a pretty good understanding as to what it's adding on. And I can always review it at a later time. But again, because of my familiarity with Kiro at this point and understanding how it creates stuff as well as what my needs are, just being able to read through the summary here is typically good enough for this type of steering document. Plus, I can always go in and change steering documents later. Steering document, I mean, it's a living document. It's not like code. I mean, code can be living, but I can always go back and tweak a steering document, remove a section, add a section, stuff like that, and it's not going to affect my code. It's just going to affect the tasks from here on out. So we're good. And we're going to start this. So this is a checkpoint for task 8. And I will let that run. It did not clean up its stuff here. I'm just going to do that for it. So what's going on here? Refresh. It says it's here. It's crazy. I mean, it's there. Maybe it was just too many at once. Okay, so phase 2. Okay, checkpoint, ensure all tests pass, so all tests pass. Awesome. All phase 2 migration objectives achieved. Now we're going to update documentation and configuration. Create or update that. Yep, that's great. And after this is task 10. So let me finish up these tasks. If there's anything that I need to come back to, I will certainly do that. Okay, so finishing up task 10, and it's prompting me for some questions. So basically, there's some known issues that there are test failures, and they're failing, but they're not related to the migration, so maybe there were pre-existing failures. It's actually good. It also reports that Jest has 26 tests and Mocha has 20. So 20, of course, is not equal to 26, but we expect that there would be fewer Mocha tests than there would be Jest tests because we're adding tests, so that's fine. As it says, it's good. We added 6. So coverage reports overall 39%, 27% branches. DIO endpoint 88%, which is good. API request class is 70%, which is good. Other than caching, this API request class is like core. If that is broken, it just doesn't work. I guess you should also say that the AWS classes are also important. What the AWS classes are is basically it's a wrapper around the classes because there's certain things that when DynamoDB is accessed or S3 is accessed or the parameter store is accessed, there's certain things that are done in terms of getting the database name and all that stuff that it just makes sense to kind of wrap those into like a central class that is used. So that's what that is. So that's also key too. These are very important ones. Coverage is not regressed, which is great. All Jest files have proper headers. Oh, okay, got it. So, should it proceed with completing this task, or would I like to investigate the failures first? Let's just investigate. If there's nothing to investigate, we'll just, it's fine. So we'll just investigate it. Okay, good. There have been a few times when I've told it to investigate a failure and it comes back and says, actually, this is expected, which is perfectly fine. It expects that when DynamoDB returns a cached data with headers, those headers should be assigned to the connection object for conditional requests. However, they're not being assigned. This suggests the cache implementation might not be properly setting the headers. Interesting. So regardless, it seems like there might be an issue with the testing implementation. So it says that there could be a difference between the way Jest and Mocha does it in terms of implementing and mocking. Okay, so this is where we have a conundrum. And we're trying to figure out exactly how, because all these tests were written, all the tests pass, but this particular test is not passing right now, or it is passing, because it says it does pass. The issue is that the Jest test and cache header assignment Jest are not part of the phase 2 migration scope. So this is something that was done before this phase, which can sometimes it's a good thing that we're at the very end here, because this allows us to then go back and maybe fix something. So let's just see what it recommends, because this is out of scope for this particular feature, but it was in scope in a previous one. Yeah, because it's testing cache functionality, not the 3 modules we migrated. All right. Okay, or not part. So now that we've completed this one, we can actually go back and so I'm confused. My confusion is if they're failing, how are all the tests passing? Okay, so basically I said let's examine the 3 failing tests in cache header assignment. How can they fail yet have all tests pass? Even if they are out of scope, let's spend some time and fix this. So Kiro says, yes, you're absolutely right. Let's investigate and fix these failing tests. The integration tests pass, but the Jest tests fail, which suggests there's an issue with how the Jest tests are mocking or interacting with the cache system. Let me first read the full failing test to understand what's happening. And I would hate if there's a problem with the implementation. This cache data package has been in use for about 6 years. Not saying that there aren't any underlying issues. There very well could be. They just haven't been important, or they just haven't been caught yet. So it says it found the issue. So the implementation correctly uses cache is valid header value, which returns false for null, and false for null and undefined. Now let me check what cache get etag and cache get last modified return. Now I understand the flow. The headers are only assigned when cache needs refresh returns true. So that's basically that the cache expired. We need to get an updated cache. Yeah, so we need to refresh the cache. The test is setting the cache to be expired, which should trigger a refresh. But the headers might not be getting read correctly from the mocked DynamoDB response. Get header normalizes undefined to null. So when the cache has undefined headers, get header returns null. Okay, so it's the correct behavior. So now it's going to go through some permutations. So why is it failing? Let me run just one more. So it kind of walked through the code and the test to see what it should be expecting, and it wasn't sure why. Aha! The test is failing because neither header is being assigned. The test expects if none match to be assigned since e-tag is valid, but it's coming back as undefined. The issue that is that the code path is going through cache extend expires because API returns 304 not modified. Okay, that makes sense. So if your server and you are using caching appropriately, you send, let's just say your cache expired. Okay, the cache has an e tag or a last modified. So you can send an e tag or a last modified, or you can send them both, and to your server, and your server says 304, you gave me a last modified date. It has not been modified since then, so your cache is still good. It doesn't send back the data, it just sends back a 304, which doesn't have additional headers, and it doesn't have any data associated with it. It's just basically giving a short response saying, yeah, what you have is good. So since there's no headers and stuff like that, there's nothing to bring back. So the test didn't seem to be mocking it properly. Yep. Okay. All right. So it's going to continue evaluating. We'll see if this is a rabbit hole, if this is actually correct. It's speculating that a certain function, an initialization function, wasn't called, and that could be causing the issue. So it's going to try implementing it to see if that fixes the issue. And as I expected, it's still failing. The issue was not that. They're just still not being assigned. This is one of those things that if you start, going down a rabbit hole and I feel like I need to steer it in a direction or maybe tell it, hey, let's rethink this, I would step in and I would say, hey, let's rethink this. If this were code, it'd be a little different. It hasn't suggested modifying the code yet. For as far as I know, if all the code is correct, it's the test that needs to be updated. And I just feel that way because the code is 6 years old. It's been running fine. Okay. So it says 2 tests, or 2 of the 3 are passing. To use the imported cached variable instead of just destructuring. Okay. So there's progress. It looks like it's now going down the same, or a better path, I should say. Aha. The mock is not being called. This means the cache is not reading from DynamoDB at all. The cache might be using the in-memory cache, or there's an issue with how the mock is set up. Cache original, which means that cache found something and returned original not modified. This means that the cache is not expired, or it's finding the data somewhere else. this is exactly where I might need to step in. So basically it says let me reread the code flow. When cache read is called and there is no existing cache entry, it returns without reading from DynamoDB. I mean, it went to DynamoDB and it basically got back there's no entry for that. So I mean it's not really a read, but it still accessed DynamoDB. DynamoDB just didn't have anything to return, so it's not really a record read. So that's correct. So it now speculates that first create a cache entry, then on the second call the cache will be read, which is true. We'll see if that's, oh, but it says it's complex. Let me check if there's a simpler way. The mock needs to match what DynamoDB actually returns. Yeah. I see. The cache read method calls DynamoDB cache read. And if there's an item, it processes it. The mock structure looks correct. The issue is that the mock isn't being called because the cache system isn't actually trying to read from DynamoDB. The solution is to ensure the cache actually finds the mock data. But wait, I just realized something. The test is setting expires, which is in the past, meaning the cache is expired, but for the cache to be read and headers to be assigned, the cache needs to exist first, which is what it said earlier. I don't know why it doesn't just create a cached object first and then do the test. And this is correct. Cache exists. It's expired. Cache read will read the expired cache from DynamoDB. Okay. Then cache needs refresh returns true because it's expired. Headers from the expired cache are assigned to connection. Yes. API is called with those headers. And basically what that means is that this here, number 4, where it says headers from the expired cache are assigned to the connection. That should be that if modified since and if when you check for an e-tag, you don't send the e-tag, you check for something else. I forget what the tag is. Those headers API returns not modified. So the mock is correct. If returning an expired cache, the issue must be that the mock isn't being used. Let me check. I'm just going to interject and just ask, what is this called? So I'm just going to ask, when the headers are assigned to the connection after a cache is returned having expired, the headers from the DynamoDB record aren't used, are they? Isn't it just modified since and if no match? Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. Okay, there we go. All right, so it says you're absolutely right. It doesn't AI always say that? I need to re-examine this. The headers being assigned are the conditional request headers. So it's not reading DynamoDB, getting the data as well as the headers. It's taking the E tag and the last modified and transforming those into the conditional headers. When you're using caching, as I explained earlier, you have an E tag, which is kind of like a hash of all the data, and then you can also have a last modified. You don't send E tag and last modified with a request. You basically say if none match, then you give it the E tag. If the data it's going to send you back matches that E tag, then it's the same data because it has the same hash. It'll just send back a 304 saying it's not modified. Saves in transmission costs basically because you're not sending a whole bunch of data back. You're just basically acknowledging, yes, the E tag you have for that data is still valid. Use that data. Same thing with last modified. If you have a last modified date and you send it as if not modified since, your server receives that. It says, no, this data has not been modified since then. It just basically sends back a 304 saying not modified. It does not need to send the body back. So you're not really sending all the headers. You're just sending two headers, if one or the other or both. And the server is acknowledging whether or not stuff has changed from what you currently have. So it says perfectly or exactly right. The code is getting the E tag from the cached response, assigning it to the connection headers if none match, getting last modified from the cache response via cache get last modified, assigning it to the connection headers if modified since. So basically, I saw it was going down the wrong path. I know the code enough to kind of know where it was getting tripped up. And I would do this with a junior developer too, or another developer, a peer, or a student. I'd be like, why don't you reread that code again? Because that's not exactly what's going on. And because I am familiar with the code, I wrote it, but also I've gone through the diagrams. I know how it works. I've spent a lot of time developing this and understanding how browser caching, how HTTP caching works, all the codes and everything, the protocol, because I spent so much time learning it. I know when AI is going down the wrong route. So it sounds like I was able to help out here. So this is correct behavior. The client sends the e-tag and the server responds with 3 or 4 not modified. Now the question is, why isn't this working in the test? The mock is returning a cache entry with these headers, but they're not being assigned. Okay, so hopefully it remembers that and I don't need to re-explain it. And yeah, by default, in-memory cache is disabled. I'm not going to say that's experimental. It was I just implemented it like 2 weeks ago. So it's somewhat experimental, but yeah, it's pretty robust. But also at the same time, because it's in memory, I it's really up to the developer to determine whether they need to turn it on or off, because there are situations where you don't want it on. So by default, it is disabled, but you can turn it on if it meets your caching needs. Caching needs would be you're returning the same data over and over and over again. You might want to disable it though if you're just returning a whole bunch of data and your cache hit rate is very low. But if you have a very high cache hit rate, then you would probably want to enable it. So it's disabled by default. And this would also be a problem. This is the same hash across multiple test runs. This means the cache is persisting between tests. The first test creates a cache entry, and subsequent tests or even the same test on the rerun are finding that cache entry. Well, we'll see here. Let's issues that we're using. I would just use unique cache keys. Oh. It seems like a lot of work, but AI is doing it. That's the nice thing about tests and some documentation, especially with the tests. It's like, I don't care. I will review operational code, functional code. I will review that line by line and understand how it works. I am not going to go in and understand how 100 and some tests work. I don't really care. As long as the tests pass, that's all I am concerned about. If I write new functionality and those tests pass and I know they are correct, great. If I do a migration like what I'm doing now and I'm using a new testing framework, the tests better pass, and I have both the old and the new to like compare. Still not being called. The mock isn't working. Um, Another nice thing I like is that when I'm writing tests and stuff, is that as long as I have committed my code and I've got the coloring on to determine what's changed, it's always nice to see that my actual code has not changed. I think I mentioned this in the previous video. I'm always scared that the AI will, when a test is failing, go back and modify code. I don't care if we're developing a new feature and we're writing code on the fly and we're writing tests, but if it's already established good code, I don't want AI rewriting it. And I'm not sure why this happens with Kiro sometimes. A lot of times it'll like try updating files and it'll just get a whole bunch of errors while editing, and I don't know why that is. Alright, this is one of those times where it's like, it's 8:47 at night. As soon as we get over this, I'm gonna consider this complete. It'll give me some time to review. Oh, I also want to point out, due to my steering documents with testing, I requested that anything that's generated by the tests, that's regenerated by the test every time, I don't want included in the Git repository, because every time you run the build or the test, it'll change that document, and then you're just committing all those changes to the repository and it's generated content. You don't need to do that, just like you don't commit builds to the repository, you just commit code. So I told it, don't commit the coverage and generated documents like that for tests. So anything that's generated, don't commit it. So it went ahead and I can tell it went in and updated the Git Ignore, and I see that it added, this was already here, but it added these two, which is great. So that way the test coverage folders are not committed to the repository. Okay, so so we have 592 Mocha tests passing, 75 Jest tests passing, 62 property tests passing, one failing with the expected test count mismatch, so that's fine. So it's successfully completed that. Fixed all 5 header assignment tests. Root cause is a getter. Okay. All right. So since this was like a round and round thing and I had like jump in and explain something, this is specific to this package about the whole default AWS DynamoDB get. And again, as I mentioned, the AWS class that I'm using here is a wrapper to do the common functions that I do with all of my calls to DynamoDB. That way I'm centralizing where I'm calling DynamoDB from. And it also allows me to create one DynamoDB client for all my calls, rather than each module creating its own DynamoDB client. You want to keep that lean, so I'm creating a static DynamoDB client that's shared amongst all invocations of the particular Lambda function. So what I want to do, since this is a AWS class that I created, I want to let Kiro know in the future that this is the case. So let's add I don't know if I should add it to the test harness. I mean, kind of. I shouldn't have said class, I should have said methods. Okay, so it's not just, it sounds like it's not just going to be the DynamoDB one, it's also going to do other ones, just addressing the pattern. So hopefully, and I can go in and I can review it, but ensuring that if it sees this pattern in any of these, because there might be future classes added to it or future methods added to it, that it will identify those two as well. So the getter problem explains why you can't directly mock methods on objects returned by getters. Spy on the getter itself. Okay. Points for mocking getters. Okay, this documentation will help future developers and AI assistants understand how to properly mock getter properties. Yep, sounds good. So that's this one here. I wonder if it added it. Yeah, okay, yeah, obviously. So yeah, we cannot directly mock methods. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. All right. So that should help. And I put it into the test harness. The test harness thing, I mean, a test harness is basically a separate hookup that you can use to plug a diagnostic machine into whatever component you're testing in the physical world. What this is here is that I have several classes who use private classes. So you're exporting a class in a file or in a script, but it might be using an internal class as well. Well, since only the public is being exported because you only want the developer to use the public interface, there's this hidden private class and even private functions within the file that testing wouldn't have access to because it's not exported. So to get around that, there's in addition to being able to export the public class, you can export. I have it set up so that it will create a test harness class that returns all the private methods and classes, and it specifically states that this should only be used for testing. So a developer in theory could, if they wanted to like get internally to the test class, use the test harness and return that. It's almost like the honor system, but you're obfuscating it a little bit, just so that people are aware, at least, that these are not public classes. It's very similar to how you could put a underscore in front of method names that were not meant to be used publicly. They're supposed to be private, but they were never really private, if you're familiar with JavaScript and stuff like that. So it is there. I could go one step further and ensure that all test harnesses are not returned if it's a production environment, or if the debug level was set to a certain level, which would mean that if a developer tried using the test harness outside of tests to actually use, undocumented APIs internally in their code, it would break when they tried to push it to production. I could do that, and I probably will in the future. I just haven't yet because of the way that I run production instances. The best way is probably to tie it with the debugging level, because I kind of run things at two different levels, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But just know that a test harness is basically a way to get access to private methods and classes that are not exported. I'll show you what it looks like. So DIO cache is one, and again, all this stuff is on GitHub, so you can go look at it. But at the very bottom, and the test harness steering document also says it needs to be at the very bottom. Alright, so test harness provides access to internal classes for testing purposes only. And it says it here several times. So then if you were like, if you saw, hey, there's a test harness object, you'd see this documentation that it's for testing only. So basically what it does is it gets the internals of this. So return cache data, S3 cache, and DynamoDB, which are all classes in this. DynamoDB is right there. But those are used by cache and cacheable data access. I never expose those to the developer. The developer needs to access the cache through cacheable data access. And this isn't exactly the cache. It's something different, but the developer needs to make requests through here, not accessing the S3 cache directly. So in order to test those, I have the test harness, and the test harness returns those undocumented methods and classes. That way we can use that for testing. And I'm really not sure why it says that this is never used. This is a class. It's a static method, which means it should be able to be used whenever. And it's been exported there. I don't know that it should be private. That would be why it marked it as private. I wonder why. I'm just going to save that. Now, I'm going to see if the hook works. curious as to why the commit hook didn't do anything. But I can always investigate that some other time. So I feel like that's good enough for today. Either tomorrow or the next day, I will go over the next set. The next one will be interesting because that's going to be security fixes. Basically, there's a few, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a few security fixes that GitHub security analyzer found. It has nothing to do with the production code. It just basically has to do with the tests. So there's a few things within the tests that it said you could probably do a little bit better. And again, it's not like the tests are running in production. They're just tests. But if I wouldn't even say it a vulnerability, there's just a best practice that could be done. So I'll implement those next. After I'm done with the security fixes and there's no breaking changes, and again, I'm doing these in a particular order. I make sure that the tests are there. Then when I do the security fixes, that those things don't break. And then after I do the security fixes, I'm going to add a new feature. And so you won't want to miss that. I'm going to be adding a new feature for if I'm calling an API that has pagination, or the API request fails intermittently, it does a retry. So you won't want to miss that. This is where I did hand code stuff. So I hand coded a whole class, essentially, 2 whole classes actually. Hand coded that. I ensured that it works, and now I copied the code. I put it into 2 examples here, and I'm giving it a example here as to how to implement it. And I'm basically saying, hey, here's my examples, here's my code examples, how this was implemented, what I want, how I want it implemented. Bring this in and implement it. So this is an example as to me writing my own code, working through it, experimenting, seeing how it all works. And then once I have a firm understanding of my own code, and I actually have pretty good code here, giving that over and telling Kiro to implement it. So, I mean, I'm keeping myself in practice. I'm having fun solving a problem. And then the hard part of actually implementing it and writing all the tests, I can hand over to Kiro. So that's it for today. I'll continue on with these at some point, and go have fun coding, building new things. I hope you can go and experiment with Kiro and learn how to use Kiro in your own development projects. And I hope to see you back for some more. Thanks for watching.